Thank you everybody for coming along this evening. And welcome to the Sidore Lecture Series. This lecture series was established by a generous donation from a prominent New Hampshire businessman early in the last century, Saul O Sidore. Sidore was a driving force in support of the ideals of humanity and brotherhood throughout New Hampshire in his time living and working in the state. And his family have continued that tradition. The Sidore Lecture Series is a venue to bring critical and controversial approaches to bear on contemporary issues in society today. And that's exactly what we have for you with Bruce Alexander. His work, of course, is addressed to our symposium theme of addiction in New Hampshire, and it contextualizes the sharp rise in opioid overdose deaths in recent years. Bruce's long career in psychology has been inspirational in pushing away from the idea that addiction is a brain disease. In his rat park studies, he demonstrated that given sufficient quality of life, that there is no inherent biological quality, in rats at least, that supported the idea that there are chemical hooks in the brain that cause addiction. Based on his work, he has been at the forefront of a paradigm shift in harm reduction, where the social and cultural contexts of isolation and dislocation have had as much a role to play as biology in addiction and substance misuse treatment. It's that cultural and social context that has animated his recent scholarship. Bruce's work has evolved away from the laboratory and into the humanities as he's pursued this paradigm shift. This work has demonstrated our relationship with addiction across human history, from Aristotle to the early modern poets. His recent work has explored differing views on the question of what it means to be addicted. And the answers, I hope, go some way towards addressing our contemporary problems with addiction in terms of prevention, a prevention that actually works, instead of the expensive, painful, and constant triage that represents our current efforts at the moment. Ultimately, I'm hoping what we can get from today is some movement towards what are the conditions under which addiction might go wrong. But that's a very complex question. Thus, to address the broad set of issues wound up in that answer, I give you Bruce Alexander.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Edward. Thank you, everybody, for coming out in the rain. And thank you to my wonderful hosts here who have made everything very comfortable for me, particularly my student hosts, Dylan and Cynthia, who showed me your beautiful campus yesterday. There's a lot to do and not a lot of time here. If I could, I would totally reframe the opioid crisis in your mind. In a way that most of you don't think of it now. I actually can't do that in 45 minutes. But if you find what I'm saying interesting, you could come and visit me. My office is on top of a hill in Burnaby, British Columbia, or you could come visit my website, which is right there, and you will find all the ideas which I'm going to say tonight in expanded form with lots of references. I'm a compulsive documenter, but I won't be documenting tonight. I want to go for the ideas rather than documentation, but I assure you, you will find it all on my website. Where to begin? We have an opioid crisis. Well, I guess I have to begin by saying it's real. I mean, I work with parents, largely now, of children, of parents whose children and whose grandchildren have died, and you can't imagine, unless you have been there, you can't imagine what that is. That's an unimaginable tragedy, and the opioid crisis has to weigh on us all in that kind of a way. It's disastrous. But it's not a random event, is it? It's not just a isolated disaster which comes up now out of nowhere. Doesn't come up out of nowhere, right? It's got a whole history, and my fear is that in our rush to formulate solutions to this problem, we forget the history, and we render ourselves incapable of solving it, because we get way too narrow. So let me just start by, in a very rough way, putting it in a historical context. Like, it's a crisis, right? It's a crisis like that hurricane that just roared through the Florida Panhandle. But of course, that hurricane was not an isolated event, right? It's a series of hurricanes, and these hurricanes, between hurricanes, there's stuff going on. Like the tide is rising, and the ocean is getting warmer, and so we can't understand the hurricane just by looking at the hurricane. And no matter how many sandbags we put out there, we can't contain the hurricane just by paying attention to the hurricane. If we're going to contain that hurricane, we're going to pay attention to the rising tide and the warming ocean, and we're going to have a much broader picture. That's what I think we have to do with this opioid crisis. I think that our first problem is that we have been deluding ourselves with some fairly simple formulas which haven't served us well. And I want to start by talking about these oversimplifications, these formulas. And in particular, I want to talk about a story which you all know. I think you all know. I think everyone in this room knows it. Every single one. I don't think you can escape knowing this story. And that doesn't mean you necessarily believe it. I think about half of you in this room, I'm basing these on some data, right? I think about half of you in this story actually believe this story to be true, and that half of you have some serious doubts about it, and some of you believe it to be completely untrue. I myself believe it to be completely untrue. So I want to introduce this story. Before I introduce the story, do you know what that is? It's an engraving from 1751, and I put it in there to make this historical point. I'm coming back to my oversimplified story, but I want to make a different point first. This particular crisis is the first of a long series of crises. And these crises go back all the way to the early 1700s, and this is the first one. This is the London gin craze of 1700s as portrayed by William Hogarth, the engraver. And you've probably seen this engraving before. Some of you will have in various circumstances. It's a famous engraving. And you'll notice that this is full of unbelievable horror. I won't catalog it all, but the lady in front is dropping her baby probably to its death because she's got syphilis. You can see it on her legs. And the gentleman in front, you can't tell if he's dead or alive. He's either starved to death or he's about to starve to death. And you'll see that in the basket. If you could see this engraving close up, you would see that in the basket. He's got tracts that he's been selling about why you shouldn't take gin. And he's also got a gin bottle and a glass. He's drinking gin as he's distributing these tracts and starving to death. And you'll notice, if you look on the left there, you can't quite make it out, but there's a starving boy and a dog fighting for a bone. One or the other of them is going to have a meal. And if you look above that, you'll see the husband and wife there. The husband has got his saw, and the wife has got her teapot, and they're trying to sell it to the pawnbroker, and you can tell from the look on his face that he's not going to give them much money for it. And the culprit in this particular strategy, in this particular crisis, was Gin. You can't say alcohol. It wasn't alcohol. They didn't even know about alcohol. The word hardly existed in the English language. It was gin. This same engraver has a picture called Beer Street, in which everybody's got a great flagon of beer, and everybody's fat and happy, and nobody's dying. And you know, it's clear that beer is a very good thing, whereas gin does this. Okay. This is one of the historical contexts that we have had a series of these drug crises, drug addiction crises. I actually can mark off my life in drug addiction crises because I was born in 1939. Do you know what the drug addiction crisis was in 1939? This is the quiz. What was the drug addiction crisis in 1939? Someone said it. Yeah, it's marijuana. Reefer madness. And how many of you have seen the movie Reefer Madness? Well, the rest of you must go out and see it tonight. You get it on Netflix and see it. It's an incredible portrayal of it's like this, only it's marijuana. It was for real. I mean, you must understand, even though, well, here in New Hampshire, you probably understand how bad marijuana is, but in those surrounding states, they seem to be legalizing it, right? They don't know but how horrible it is. But you guys do, right? Well, it was every bit as terrifying as gin, and every bit as terrifying as opioids. That's the point I put this picture in to make, and I wanted to make sure I made that point, that this opioid crisis is the latest in a series of drug crises, and there's many in between. You know what came before the opioid crisis, right? What crisis? No, not crack. Methamphetamine. Then comes crack. Then comes powder cocaine. Tell me if I start flailing my arms around too much. Then comes powder cocaine. Then what's before that? Heroin. And before that, it gets a little vague there, but there's benzodiazepines, there's meprobamate. And for a while there was, believe it or not, you don't remember probably, airplane glue. Do you remember airplane glue? No. But you have to be old. My main criteria,
Adjust your microphone.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Let me actually mute this.
I'm being adjusted.
Yeah, it moved on us.
We all get adjusted.
Let's try this again.
Okay, I am now the best adjusted one in the room, I think.
All right, hopefully that stays. Let's give that a go.
Okay. All these drug crises, in the meantime, each one is a hurricane or a tsunami. In the meantime, the tide keeps rising. So how do we deal with this? Well, we deal with this partly by narrative. That's how we deal with things. We tell a story, and this is back to where I interrupted myself. We tell a story. You know that picture. But here's the story. This is the one I'm saying that you all know this story. I bet there's no one in the room. If you do, tell me if there's someone in the room who doesn't know this story. But the addictive drugs are the primary cause of our addiction problem and of other important social problems, crime, poverty, corruption. In the case of the London gin craze, the primary problem was starvation. Gin was causing starvation. Now it's causing overdose. Opioids are causing overdose. In the heroin crises, heroin was causing crime. The drug is not only causing direct harm through addiction, but it's causing ancillary problems. 2, addiction occurs because individuals use addictive drugs and get hooked. That's how it happens. See, there's the causal statement. We have an addiction crisis because people use drugs and get hooked. And the people who get hooked lose their free will to resist their cravings. That means they're really no longer human beings. They are under control of this drug. They have lost their human agency. And for successful recovery from addiction must come from professionals or specialized self-help groups, or I could have said, or from police, or from drug administrations, or whatever. There's got to be an intervention by someone else. You know the story. I don't think there's anyone here who doesn't know that story, right? And some of you, I think, probably believe most of that story. I want to say it's totally false. All of it's false. And I will not try to convince you with evidence. I would actually, if you had me back not for a single evening, but a whole semester, I would convince you, probably, that that's not true. There's tons of evidence that none of that is true. But it's a powerful cultural story. It's a story which influences all of us, whether we, even myself, like I don't believe it, but I feel really awkward. My friend is in great pain. He's having bone surgery, and he won't take his opioids because he's afraid he'll get hooked. And he's suffering. I mean, he's a dear friend. And he's suffering incredible pain, and I don't want to say to him, Jerry, take the opioids. He won't take them because he believes this story. So I believe that this story is very powerful. It affects everybody. And this story is propagated, like it's a well-funded story. There's such a thing as the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which gets about $1 billion a year budget to sponsor research, which all supports this story in various ways. I mean, it used to be that they would support this story, for example, in terms of the conditioning theories of psychology. This is 50 years ago when I entered the field. They used to support this story with conditioning theories of psychology. Now they support it with neurological theories of dopamine. And all of these supports are really well researched. It's excellent research, but it doesn't get it. It doesn't get you there. Well, so this story has been told in all really of the drug crises that have come. We've told this story. We just changed the name of the drug. And the rhetoric that goes with this story is powerful. I mean, the images are powerful, and the impetus to action is powerful. We must act. We must act now. Even if we act wrong, it's better than doing nothing, right? We have to swing into action. So President Duterte of the Philippines is telling us, well, we've got to have a lot of extrajudicial killings. And President Trump of the United States is saying to President Duterte, well, you're doing a great job. Did you know that? And President Trump visited New Hampshire a year ago or so and said, well, we've got to energize our efforts to control drugs, because somehow if we can keep these drugs out of the country, we'll stop this from happening. Well, we could hope that if we believe the old story, if we could just keep the drugs out of the country, this wouldn't happen. Problem is that we've tried that solution a great deal. We have a whole history of spending enormous amounts of money on the so-called war on drugs and accomplishing nothing. Now, I would like you to look at this, what I'm calling the familiar story, and you'll see that you can take it really two ways. If you put your emphasis on the first two of those portions of the familiar story, then you're likely to have a war on drugs, right? If you say, well, the addictive drugs are the cause of our problem, all our problems, and the addiction occurs simply because individuals take the drug. Well, we just got to get rid of the drug. We got to do everything to have a war on drugs. But if you put your emphasis on the last part of this, you get a different kind of an impulse to action. People who lose their free will to resist their cravings, well, we've got to do something for those people. They've lost their free will. Well, we've got psychologists like me. I'm a psychologist. And we've got psychiatrists, and somehow we'll give people back their free will. We'll find a way to restore their sanity, really. And there'll be all kinds of professional methods. We'll set our professionals to work. And we'll devise not only different kinds of psychotherapy, we'll devise vaccines. And we'll devise CBT. And we'll devise all kinds of methods to get out of it. So this familiar story, although it is a single narrative, it has led historically in two different directions. And the good news is that in most countries of the world, the war on drugs portion of this, which has been quite ineffective and quite cruel, has declined in importance. People are not doing war on drugs nearly as much as they were, with the exception of President Duterte, and some other exceptions. But generally speaking in the world, there has been a very strong movement away from the war on drugs towards medical and psychological interventions, towards treatment. That's the good news, because the war on drugs was very cruel, and is, where it's still going on. The bad news is that even as we move away from the war on drugs into a more treatment-oriented and harm reduction-oriented kind of approach, the problem doesn't get any better. So, for me, that's very personal, because I live in a city, Vancouver, which is, we think we're famous because we have done so much to move away from the old war on drugs routine. We used to have two big prisons within the city limits, the city and the suburb limits, two big prisons that were mostly all the time filled with drug users. And some other people got to go there too, but they were mostly filled with drug users. Well, both prisons are torn down because we don't do that anymore. And we have the Insite, which is a place where you can go and safely take drugs. It's a drug consumption room. Well, we have many drug consumption rooms, but Insite was the first one in North America, and we're very proud of that. And we have all kinds of free treatment. You don't need to see an insurance company. You just go and get your free treatment from the social workers or from the various agencies around the city where you can get free treatment. And we're very proud of that, and we're doing a lot less harm than we used to be doing, but our addiction problem is as high as any place else. And we have an opioid crisis which is absolutely comparable to your opioid crisis in terms of number of deaths. It hasn't got us out of the problem at all. My contention here is that the old story is useless. both, no matter how you take it, no matter how you interpret it. I mean, if you interpret it in the second way, well, okay, you're doing a lot less harm, you're not hurting people as much, but you're still in big trouble. So, I want to talk about a historical perspective as an alternative to this familiar story. Let's see what comes up next. Aha. And I want to tell you how I got to, I'll tell you first about how I got to this alternative, this historical perspective. It had to do with the fact that I was a young professor. We're now back 50 years in Vancouver. Here I am, a young professor, and I am assigned to go and treat heroin addicts in the methadone clinic, because we had methadone. And my job is to tell these young guys, well, you know, you should really not take any more heroin on top of your methadone, and you shouldn't take the methadone either. You should just stop taking all your drugs. That was my assignment as a young psychologist. Well, it's impossible, as you might know, but it's interesting, right? Because here I am, a man of about 30, and these guys are not much younger than me. In fact, some of them are older than me, and I'm in there to cure them. And I have in my mind, of course, the familiar story, right? And so I know that they're out of control completely, and all this stuff. They've become hooked because they took the drug and all this. But they start telling me a different story. They start telling me cops and robbers stories. They say, well, you know, this is how we trick the cops. And they're enjoying telling me these cops and robber stories. Now, bear in mind, these guys have got scars and missing teeth because the police in Vancouver in those days were absolutely brutal to drug users. So these guys are not winning in this cops and robbers adventure they're having, but it is an adventure. And they're telling me about this adventure. And I say, well, no, wait a minute. Let's talk about stopping using drugs. And they say, yeah, we'll talk about that. But they quickly shift the terrain back to the cops and robbers stories, and the women are telling the stories about, you know, dealing with the Johns, how we make sure these guys pay and make sure we don't get in trouble, and how we take care of each other in the, you know, us girls. And they're telling me these kind of stories, and I'm realizing that they don't see it in terms of the familiar story that I learned in graduate school. They don't see it that way at all. Some do. I mean, I'm not saying that the people that I were talking to in those days are totally consistent with each other, but I'm generalizing in a way which I think is fair. Most don't, and most are and I say, well, you know, you're out of control, right? And they say, sure, man, I'm out of control. But they're not talking like they're out of control. They're talking like they're doing something. They're using this lifestyle which they have for some kind of purpose, and it's not working for them brilliantly, because they're, you know, users in those days spent more than half their lives in jail. It's not working for them brilliantly, but it's something that they're doing. So I go back to my students in the university and I say, I'm hearing these stories on the street. And some of my students say, well, that's really interesting. You know, we got to pursue that. Maybe that familiar narrative that we've learned isn't fully true. And others of my students say, sometimes really loud from the back row, one guy said, but what about the rats? And by that he meant that in those days, part of the familiar story was that if you put rats in boxes like this, called Skinner boxes, and you set it up so that when they press the lever on the wall, they get an injection, not in their back, the tube goes in their back, but under their skin there's an inner tube that you can't see, and it goes right into their jugular. So they're getting an injection right in their jugular vein, which means right in their brain, essentially. It goes right up into the brain, of heroin. And this experiment was headline news in the early 1970s. What does this prove? It proves that when the rats are in this Skinner box, they will take, most of them, will take very large quantities of heroin. Some of them will take so much that it's as if they've forgotten to eat. They will literally, some actually starve to death taking these drugs, and they will overdose. So hadn't I heard about the rats? Because this proves, what does this prove? This was said to prove that these drugs have irresistible effects, even to rats. Like this drug is so irresistible that it isn't just irresistible to people. It doesn't just hook people, it hooks all God's creatures. I mean, this is the drug, this is the familiar story, right? Only it's illustrated with rats. Well, the revolutionary thing for me personally was that I met a bunch of honor students, and they said, well, look, let's approach this experimentally. Well, that was my job. I'm an experimental psychologist. And so we built Rat Park. There it is. And you can see that it was quite a spacious, is nothing like being confined in a little cage. Because the idea was, maybe those rats in the little cage take that heroin, not because the heroin is an irresistible drug. Maybe they're in solitary confinement. Is that possible? Could solitary confinement do that? Well, I don't know if any of you have been in solitary confinement, but okay. Is it possible?
It's possible.
Yeah. Well, I know lots of guys who've been in solitary confinement, and they say that too. Yeah. I mean, you're going crazy in there, and yeah, you might want to take something to relieve the distress. Anyone else been in solitary confinement? Okay, good. You're our expert for the night. And maybe if the rats are in something like a more normal rat environment, maybe they're not going to be that addicted. Maybe not that responsive to the drug. Maybe the drug is not going to be irresistible to them. We don't know whether rats are addicted or not. We have no idea. But we know that they take the drugs. So this Rat Park is modeled after my garage floor because my garage floor happens to be an ideal environment for rats, which I have known by observation. So it's modeled after except that we painted a forest on the wall just to make it more photogenic. But basically, it's a garage floor. And and then we test the rats, of course, in the Rat Park, and the rats in cages, which are comparable in size to those Skinner boxes, which you saw earlier. And we find that the difference is very large, that the rats in the Skinner boxes drink a huge amount more of morphine solution, which is what we're using, than do the rats in Rat Park. And then we repeat this experiment in various ways. Like you can play various tricks. For example, you can pre-addict the rats by giving them only morphine to drink for a long time before you do the experiment in both environments. And then you see, does the difference between the two environments persist? And it does. So what does this suggest? Well, for one thing, it suggests that the old story, the familiar story is just not true. And it isn't. But it suggests that maybe it has a lot to do with what your life is like. Maybe your affinity for addictive kinds of substances and lifestyles has a lot to do with what your life is like. And from there, well, the next thing that happened to me was we got kicked out of our rat laboratory because we couldn't get any grants to continue this work. Nobody wanted to hear this work. And We published it, of course, in very good, reputable journals because, our research is excellent research. It's done properly. And we published it in journals, but nobody read it. And so it disappeared. Rat Park disappeared, both as an idea in the psychopharmacological literature, and the Rat Park experimenters disappeared because we didn't have a laboratory anymore. And so I was very interested in this idea, so I kind of changed my career. I ceased being an experimental psychologist and I became a person who does his research primarily in the library. And I started looking at it historically. You can look historically. You can ask the question historically, does environment make a big difference in the susceptibility of individuals for addiction? And you find that it does. And, here's Rat Park again. This is to show, by the way, that Rat Park was not just a place where the rats could run around and play, but it also provided opportunities for meditation. And there's what happens when you put male and female rats in a park. Eventually you have little rats. So I went to the library, and over the course of 40 years, developed a historical perspective. Only this historical perspective is not my idea originally at all. I would love to take credit for it, but it isn't mine. This idea was stated from, I think originally by Plato. And I know that some of you are in a course that is, because I met Dylan who took me around the other day, told me he's in a course by Plato and you're reading the Republic. And if you want to see Plato state something close to this idea, go to Stephanus line 544a in the Republic and read from there. I think it's in book 8 of the Republic. So this idea is not my idea at all. This idea has all kinds of historical basis to it, as does the old story, incidentally. I mean, the familiar story, the one I was talking about before, that very simple story has all kinds of historical basis too. It doesn't make it true that it has historical basis, but it shows where our cultural narratives come from, right? They're cultural. They come from all kinds of places in our history. So consider this possibility. Consider this as an alternative to that oversimplified story, which I'm saying is completely false. That the social fragmentation of the modern age mass produces human dislocation. There's a bit of jargon in there, right? Let me unpack the jargon for you. The modern age, in the context of the humanities, like in everyday language, the modern age is like after microwave ovens were invented, right? But in the humanities, the modern age refers to a period which is about 500 years old. It starts with Columbus, or we can date it to Columbus. We could also date it to Jean Calvin if we want to, or we could date it in lots of ways. But let's say it starts with Columbus. The social fragmentation of the modern age mass produces human dislocation. Well, social fragmentation, what does that mean? That means that from Columbus onward, the whole enterprise of modernity has had the effect of fragmenting an earlier tradition. So if you think of what Columbus did, or think of what happened in this country, think of what happened in Canada, these countries are settled by white guys, like most of us, because they came in and butchered, fragmented the existing cultures of the red guys that were here before. Now, it wasn't like a haphazard thing. Every single tribal culture of Aboriginal people was fragmented. except there's maybe 1 or 2 left in the Amazon that haven't been discovered yet, but they wouldn't be very big. Every single one is fragmented. And what happens when people are fragmented, when cultures are fragmented? Well, the people are, I use the word dislocated. They're at a loss. I'm going to go ahead for a minute, and I'm going to come back. Here's Columbus. Here's the picture version of the historical perspective, which I want to try to get across. That beginning with in the time of Columbus, societies got fragmented dramatically. I mean, we talk about the native Indian population of the United States and Canada. They weren't just fragmented a little bit. Those cultures are destroyed. And people are left as people are without culture. There's all kinds of words for this in sociology or existential psychology. We can talk about anomie, or we can talk about lack of identity, or we can talk about meaninglessness. We can talk about a psychological disaster which happens. And so fragmenting societies leads to the mass dislocation of individuals. Now, I keep watching this watch because I will finish at 6:30, so there'll be time for questions. This fragmentation process starts with Columbus, and it's well documented. You may not have learned it in grade school, but it's well documented that the incredible damage, cultural damage that was done by the invasion, not only of North America, but of course of Africa, of Asia, by the invading European people. People are dislocated all over the world, and this fragmentation process is still going on. It's not over. We're still in the modern age, right? Only now we don't think of it so much in terms of going in and driving people off their lands onto reservations. Now we think of it more in terms of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Do you know that term? This is a term I have learned recently. This is the idea that people are being implanted with all kinds of computers, so that we're augmented, and the function of that, of course, is that we're connected to the world, and we're connected to each other in a way which is mechanically and computationally amazing. It's wonderful, but it's breaking down the structures, the other connections, the kind of face-to-face connections and elbow-to-elbow connections which are more normal for the human species. Those are being broken down. And free markets, the power of markets over human culture, the fragmentational power of markets over human culture is amazing. So that, even people are driven off the land so that the land can produce more stuff. And then they're driven into towns, and they form cultures in the towns. And then the coal company comes in, makes a coal mine, and the culture of the town is transformed so that the people are able to provide labor for the coal mine. And then the coal mine closes. And then the people are dislocated again and again. This is the history of fragmentation as we know it, and it leaves us with mass dislocation of individuals, and it leaves us with a flood of addiction. The historical fact is that where you can demonstrate human dislocation on a large scale, the sequela, what follows it, is addiction, large-scale addiction. So, for example, the people I have worked with on this topic, the native people of British Columbia, where I live, these were among the most recently settled Aboriginal people. They were driven off their land only in the 19th century. They were driven off their land and their ocean. These people were whalers, some of them. They caught whales in canoes. I mean, these were tough human beings, and they were highly organized. They had really complex cultures, which we know about. The reason we know about them is at the same time the colonists arrived, the anthropologists arrived, and the missionaries. And the anthropologists and missionaries marveled at what they found. They marveled at the complexity of these cultures, which has all been fragmented. It's all gone. These people now have a secondary culture, which is grown up on the reserves where they're forced to live. And the secondary culture, well, some of that's all gone, because then the pipeline comes through, and the people have to break up their secondary culture to accommodate the pipeline. And these stories get very, very complicated. But the point is that after dislocation comes a flood of addiction. So in these native groups, which I'm talking about, which are my own personal experience, what comes after they're dislocated is mass alcoholism. And how do we explain that mass alcoholism comes after the dislocation of these cultures? Well, with the familiar story. We say, well, native people just can't handle alcohol. And so when they take it, they get hooked. And when they get hooked, they can't control themselves. And therefore, we have to cure them by sending in the shrinks. Too bad it didn't work. Too bad it isn't true. When people get dislocated, there's a flood of addiction. But why is there a flood of addiction? Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious, I think, now. Now it's obvious. It wasn't at the time this was happening historically. But people who are dislocated, people who have really no identity, really no purpose, no sense of belonging, no close associations, no traditional ties with their neighbors, or their grandfathers didn't know each other, and people who are broken out of that social kind of milieu, which is absolutely the normal way for human beings to live before the modern age. Well, in a short way, because we're rushing here, they don't have a life. And they don't have a real life. And addiction provides a life. This is something which we have forgotten. In the familiar story, as well, addiction is what happens when you bang the drug and you lose your mind. You get hooked. Well, no. Addiction is something people can do when they haven't got anything else to do. They can create a life. So these guys that I used to talk to as a young psychologist, they were telling me about their lives. Like they were part of junkie culture. Not only were they part of a cops and robbers culture, which they took some satisfaction in, even though they got bashed and went to jail all the time. But they had an identity, right? And they could identify with Janis Joplin, or not then, but now, Philip Seymour Hoffman, or Amy Winehouse, or Kurt Cobain. Addiction provides an identity, and it provides a way of adapting to dislocation. And the evidence for that, well, again, I'm not going to summarize it in 90 seconds here, but the evidence for that is extensive. It's clinical evidence, and it's based on the testimony of a great many very addicted people. So now we've got a flood of addiction, and of course it's killing people. But it's also a form of adaptation, right? So that we have to understand the consequences of addiction in two ways. That everybody's addicted, it provides some sort of individual adaptation, like okay, you've got an identity and you know what you're going to do when you get up in the morning, even if it's just go out and sell your body to buy dope. You know what you're going to do. You are at least somebody. So for everybody, addiction has a kind of a short-term individual adaptation function. And for some people, that short-term adaptation function gets you through the crisis of dislocation, and you find something else to do, and you can get out of it. So that's arrow number 2. I don't know if you can read those numbers on the arrows there, but that's arrow number 2. That says that, some people get out of this vicious cycle that I'm drawing here because their addiction has worked for them, and they get out of it. They leave it behind. You may not know this. You may not even believe this. But the most common outcome for people who are seriously addicted is to get out of it by themselves without treatment. Because it serves its function, it's done, and then they get into something else. They get religion, or they have a baby, or I'm usually the one that happens to. Sometimes it happens when I'm giving a speech. Yeah, they get out of it. Some people do, but some people don't. And that's the arrow number 3, and that is some people don't get out of addiction, and so their situation gets worse. This becomes a vicious cycle. They increase their own fragmentation, and they increase their own dislocation, and they get more addicted, and they die. But most of the addictions, and here's, again, we're leaving the old story, the familiar story, I want to call it. We're leaving that familiar story behind. Most people who get addicted are not getting addicted to drugs. They're getting addicted to food, or they're getting addicted to weird sex, or they're getting addicted to shopping, or they're getting addicted to making lots and lots of money. And these kind of producer and consumer, these kind of economic addictions are, again, I wish I could show you all the statistics. They're way more common than drug addictions, and they do way more harm. So if we talk about people who are, let's say people who are addicted to making tons of money, well, what does that do to society? It increases the fragmentation of society. And in Canada, people who are addicted to making more money join a Canadian mining company, and they go to Brazil or someplace, and they continue fragmenting Aboriginal people, and they continue wrecking the land. And we have a vicious cycle. Now I'm going back to this picture, this other guy. This is the historical perspective which I would like you to consider, and I realize I have not had any real opportunity to document it, but I will assure you that there is ample documentation for all of this. The social fragmentation of the modern age mass produces human dislocation. Many people use addiction to adapt to their dislocation. You see, this is contradicting that other story. The other story says they're out of control, they can't help it. This story says they know what they're doing. They may not know it, they may not be able to verbalize it, but they're doing something, and they feel an active role in what they're doing. Addiction can ultimately increase social fragmentation and individual dislocation, creating a vicious cycle. And that's the picture I tried to show you, that vicious cycle. Compassionate treatment interventions can lessen the suffering. They cannot stem the flood of addiction because they hardly address the cause. And this gets us back to psychologists like me. Like, we treat people. I have treated people for 50 years in addiction, and I've helped some people, but not very many. And all the treatments that we know have that kind of a track record. I have used certain kinds of psychological treatments, and they work for a few people, but for the very large number, number one, the very large number won't even come and see me, and number two, of the number who do come and see me, the very large number are not helped. Every psychologist, I think, if they're being honest, will tell you that same story. And every doctor and every treatment organization. Why? Because we're trying to repair the person who isn't broken. I mean, the person isn't sick. They're just doing the best they can in order to survive in a particular kind of a dislocated world. That's the best they can come up with. Well, if we're going to help them, we've got to address that cause, which means that only epical social change, I love this phrase, epical social change, can bring the current flood of addiction under control. Now, I'm going to stop right now, but let me stop just with a question. It is common to say by people in the National Institute of Drug Abuse and in the professional psychological organizations that addiction is a disease, and then they want to say, well, it's a disease, it's a chronic disease, meaning it's a disease that can't be ended. It's a disease like Alzheimer's, because Alzheimer's, you can't cure it, but you can help people a little bit. You can help them manage it, but you can't cure it. I want to say addiction is not a disease like Alzheimer's or asthma or any of those other chronic diseases. I want to say addiction is a problem like climate change, in the sense that if we're going to solve it, we have not just got to put sandbags up around the latest hurricane site. We've got to find out why the ocean's getting warmer. And we're doing that. That is Edward referred to a paradigm shift. That paradigm shift is underway. Lots of people are thinking this way. It isn't just me. I hope you will consider thinking this way too. And if you want some more information on this, take a look at my website. Thank you very much.
So Professor Alexander tells me that he loves really hard questions. So we're going to have some time for questions now. We'll have two runners with microphones. If you could take a moment to wait until the microphone comes to you before you ask your question, that would be amazing. All comers, please.
Yes, hard questions, please.
Hi, thank you so much for that. So I'm thinking about human dislocation in the modern world, and for all of us being in the modern world, it's such a natural thing. We don't really know anything else. Not a lot of us, other than people like me, spend a lot of time in the pre-modern world.
Yeah.
When we're thinking of the modern world and dislocation, and we're looking at the population of New Hampshire. When we're thinking about dislocation in the earlier periods, you were talking about it's like a conquering nation that comes and breaks up a community. But here in the United States, there must be a different kind of process going on, right? A type of dislocation. And what I'm really wondering is, have you looked at the difference between societies that have the nuclear family as the typical settlement pattern versus the extended family or extended kinship group as being the typical kind of residence pattern? Because these other societies that you've been talking about that don't experience addiction tend to live in these more extended kinship groups, villages, large families with grandparents and this sort of thing. But in the modern world now, we don't usually live like that, and people are living much more isolated than they ever have.
Yeah, well, I think you know the answer to that question. Yeah, the social structure of Aboriginal people is all extended families, and even more extended than we would normally think of it. People are all members not only of a family, but the family is extended to include other members of the clan. They may not even know their blood relationship to other members of the clan. And the family is extended vertically to include the ancestors who are dead. And it's extended vertically in the other direction to include the seventh generation of people who are going to come. So yeah, there's an amazing extension to what we think of as a family here. And somehow that is very close to the normal way of living. I should say that the other thing about Aboriginal people is they're not noble savages. I mean, they have all the problems that other people have. They have wars, and they have torture, and they have slavery, and they have insanity. They have all these. But the one problem that Aboriginal people don't have, which makes them really useful in this context, is they really almost never have problems which could be identified as addiction. And I think it's largely because, and thank you for pointing this out, the very extensive relationship of not only their direct social relationships, but their traditions, they are always embedded. They are never alone. They are never lonely. They can't possibly be lonely. Their ancestors are always there. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. Regarding the epical social change, I'm wondering if you've seen any first steps or really grassroots movements that have started that epical social change, and could you describe what those are and what you want to see happen next in order to bring the flood of addiction under control?
Well, again, thank you for that question. There's such a thing as the recovery movement, and I see it. I mean, it's in the United States, it's in Canada, but I've seen it best developed in England. And the recovery movement is people who want to bring together people with addiction problems into recovery houses, where the goal of the recovery house is not to do treatment. It's not like AA. Incidentally, nothing against AA. AA is fine too in its own way. But the recovery movement is not like AA. It's recovery houses where people get together, and the effort is to live a normal life and to integrate the recovery house into the larger culture of the town. And so, of course, there's sobriety parades and there's all kinds of events. The intention there is to create. It's not to go back to the way that people lived in pre-modern times. We can't do that. But it's to accelerate the evolution of a society in modern times which is differently oriented. It's not oriented towards heavy production or anything like that. It's oriented. It's humanly oriented, and I find that enormously stimulating. Also, I am a huge fan of Pope Francis. I am not a Catholic. I am not a Christian or even a spiritual person. But Pope Francis knows all of this. He could have given this speech. And he's saying, look, we've got to, it's an ecumenical message. He's saying, look, we have to break down the kinds of sectarian divisions between people. We have to refocus on community in the largest sense. I mean, community is a word which is easy to trivialize, but in the largest sense, he's saying, we can do that, we can do that. And there's a whole tradition of liberation theologists, priests, who are doing this work in Latin America, same kind of work, just taking people who have been badly dislocated and regrouping them. I think also that there has to be that's a beginning, this is the beginning of a paradigm shift. I want to see the paradigm shift get way bigger. I want to see it turn into a political philosophy which can be directed against, dare I say, the corporate state. There is, I believe, many people believe, such a thing as a corporate state, where the ultimate guiding principles are market principles, and that's going to kill us. And I think that that kind of political evolution is underway as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned those recovery houses, because my brother-in-law actually was recovered from his heroin addiction in that type of home.
Oh, did he?
And it's been 6 years, and he's never looked back.
Well,
so
hooray.
it's just really great to know that that's happening in other places as well.
Oh,
So
that's happening big time. I do a lot of public speaking, and a lot of it is at various kinds of recovery house organizations who are, they're everywhere.
Thank you.
Thank you for speaking. I agreed with 99% of what you said.
I want to know about the other 1%.
Yeah, well, I'll get to that actually. My personal addiction started when I was in high school, and I was friends mostly with my sister's friends who were older. And when they all went to college, I became dislocated or lost my identity in the social realm, and smoking pot brought back that identity and,
Sure.
and friends. Later, when I was suspended from high school, kicked out of college, and ran into some issues from the smoking pot, I lost that identity that I had formed, and that's when I went to opiates. And for me, I think that the opiates actually continue to, for me at least, they continue to take away that identity because it's such a, nobody wants to associate with that type of person, and even people that are in those groups aren't very friendly to each other. So for me, the opiates were more of a escape from the feelings that loss of identity created, which I think is why opiate addiction in particular results in death so often and is so hard for people to get out of. But yeah, I thank you for your speech, and what I would like to do in the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully, is try to start a community where people can, addicts can live along with maybe people that aren't addicts, but basically in a community that's not driven by corporate greed, but where people can live in a community and work in a community towards a collective goal. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I see where the 1% is too. Very interesting comment. I mean, as I said, I know a lot of people who were part of a junkie culture, but that was a long time ago. There's still a junkie culture, but you're talking about something else, and I think we need to make the distinction between addiction and dependence. Like here's a definition of addiction from the Oxford English Dictionary. This is the Supreme Court of dictionaries. It has to be right. State of being dedicated or devoted to a thing, an activity or occupation, adherence or attachment. Well, you're not describing your relationship to opioids that way. You're describing your relationship to marijuana more that way, but you're not describing. So I want to raise the question, maybe you weren't addicted to opioids. Maybe you were simply dependent. Maybe you were just using them because they control the pain. And of course, a person can overdose and die when they're doing that too. I'm not saying that isn't dangerous, but I'm saying that the whole issue is really complex, and there's all kinds of different paths, and you've described one. And I think in the current opioid crisis, there is a certain amount of addiction. There's a certain amount of people who are really into opioids, but there's also a lot of people who refer to their opioid drug in uncomplimentary ways. I mean, guys I know, they talk about their drug and they don't call it OxyContin, they call it shit. Or junk is another word. How come they're calling their drug junk or shit? Maybe they're not devoted to it at all. Maybe they're using it. Maybe it is an escape. As you've described, a painkiller and an escape, it's good for that too. So I think you're opening up another dimension of the problem, which I've overlooked because I'm concentrating here on addiction in the sense of being, really wrapped up and involved with something in a kind of a positive way. But I think you've expanded the discussion, in other words. We could be done. Yeah.
Yeah, so I also want to say thank you for coming to New Hampshire. New Hampshire really needs ideas like this.
Thank you.
So I guess my question is kind of picking up on a question that was asked from down there as far as how you see culture changing, and you spoke about this recovery movement, which is great. I work at a recovery center, I'm a person in recovery, like it's awesome, but how far do you think society has to go away from the war on drugs and punitive measures for using and sharing drugs? Do you envision full legalization? Do you envision a prescription model? And how far can we take legalization or decriminalization or even evidence-based harm reduction models? Like, what do you see working, and like how far is too far in your opinion?
I think all those things you've described are sandbags. The hurricane is coming, and treatment is a sandbag, and I mean, well, the opioid addiction hurricane is coming. Treatment is a sandbag. Harm reduction is a sandbag. Like I'm part of the harm reduction movement. I must say I have sweat blood for the harm reduction movement. I totally believe in it, but it's only a sandbag. I mean, it just keeps people alive. It doesn't keep them from getting addicted. You go to Portugal, who has the most wonderful harm reduction movement in the planet right now. They've still got all kinds of new addiction coming. So I think that, you know, it's like the sandbags. You could put up lots of sandbags and your roof will still blow off. And there'll still be another larger hurricane next couple of years because the ocean's getting warmer. I think we've got to deal with the fact that the ocean is getting warmer. And I think we are beginning to do that. Are we going to succeed? Well, it's not clear we're going to succeed in the case of hurricanes, and it's not clear we're going to succeed in the case of the addiction hurricanes either. But there's an awful lot of people working on it and taking it very seriously. So I'm kind of hoping we can, because I have grandchildren.
Very right, and also very depressing, because you feel like, well, we're not doing anything about climate change, or it seems impossible to stop, given things the way they are, and it sort of feels impossible to stop addiction when you consider it in the way you're talking about as a result of modernity. So I'm working with a lot of students right now who, some of them are interested in taking some kind of action about the opioid crisis. They might be forming a task force about addressing it in New Hampshire.
Oh.
What would be your advice to them? I mean, is harm reduction, you know, sandbags are still useful, right? So what would be your advice of the number one thing they could do to help this problem?
Yeah. I mean, if we want to save lives, harm reduction is doing it. In all kinds of places, the data is really clear. You should have safe injection sites. You should have needle exchanges. And the United States, unfortunately, is lagging behind in those measures. And those measures are extremely useful. And they're good sandbags. And then I think you should think beyond that as well.
So can you be more specific about that? I mean, so what would be an action that a current college student could take to create this kind of major ethical social change?
You know, I really can't. I'm a Green. I vote for the Green Party in Canada. I live in the only riding in Canada where we have both a Green member of Parliament and a Green provincial member. So I'm a Green. And I would say, you know, if you're a university student, you want to do something about opiate addiction, do something about the environment. And you'll I mean, the ecological environment, the green environment, and you will find that all of a sudden you're working with a group of wonderful people who are trying to change the world. And not only will you help to change the world, but you will be establishing your own psychosocial integration, if I can use such a phrase. You'll be joining with other people together in a way that's going to be very good for you in terms of your own identity and your own psychological health. And well, I guess I can't go much farther than that. You know, we sit in Canada and we look. across the border on our screens, and we see the chaos, political chaos here, and I don't think I think both Canadians who are of the conservative kind of bent and those who are of a liberal kind of orientation see the same chaos. I wouldn't even know how to advise a person to do anything in the United States other than you could come to Canada.
It's cooler there anyway, right?
But okay.
I've already got the mic, so I'm going to take liberty. So thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I, too, agree with the majority of what you were talking about. My question is, and you and I spoke a little bit earlier about kind of, my research focuses on mental health and suicide, and so I'm curious to hear you talk about kind of the flip side of dislocation and the potential negative consequences of over-integration. And you mentioned anomie, which is a very, kind of Durkheimian, term, and of course, over-integration also, kind of factors into his ideas about suicide and
I didn't know
negative
that.
consequences.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you envision, the cure, so to speak, for dislocation, being integration, but is there a possibility that we would get to a point where there's over-integration?
Of course.
And what do you think might be some of the negative consequences of that?
Well, I think there was a time in Western cultural history where over-integration in society was much more of a possibility than it is now. I mean, back to the time of Freud. And the disease that people feared then was not so much addiction as schizophrenia. And I think, to me, the schizophrenia literature is very compelling. There are very well integrated but totally dysfunctional societies and totally dysfunctional families, and we don't so much have that problem anymore because we've moved towards extreme individualism. We're just so separated. But it's hard for me. Like I lived through the 1960s as a young person. I had way longer hair. And it was easy for me to see that there was a really important time to break away from what seemed like over-integration into the values that I had grown up with, which were, it seemed to me, suffocating and so forth. So yeah, there's no doubt that's a problem. And I think that's the nature of all human problems. It's a matter of balance, and that's why simple formulas always fail us. It has to be a balancing formula. It has to be finding a way to get it right. And we just keep trying. I think that's the process.
Thank you.
We hear a lot about children being born into addiction and babies being born with, predilections or tendencies towards addiction. Do you think that is an extension of the social environment they're born into, or do you think there is something to be said for the chemistry or the neurology of that?
Well, I'm not well enough informed on that. I'm going to answer you, but I want to preface it by saying I went to the last two meetings of the American Society of Human Genetics and I'm not a geneticist, obviously, but I wanted to ask that question to geneticists. And I did. I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of geneticists. And what they say is quite different than what is being said in the sort of the social science literature on that topic. What they say is we have no genetics of addiction because it's not a measurable phenotype. This is the jargon they use. We can't measure it well enough to determine what its heritability is. Now, there are, if you know the genetics literature, you'll know there is some heritability studies, some twin studies and stuff, and they do show some correlations, right? There is some measurable, to the degree that it's measurable, there is some apparent heritability, but you have to ask there, what is being inherited? For example, I mean, suppose that a person inherits just some kind of weirdness, whatever. Well, that's going to make them more likely to not find a place in the world, and it's going to make them more vulnerable to addiction. But it's not that they've inherited addiction. It's they've inherited some kind of an obstacle to belonging, to have a good place in the world. For example, there is a correlation between left-handedness and alcoholism. Now, I happen to be left-handed. Therefore, I'm slightly more likely to be alcoholic. But is that because there's somehow a link between the gene for left-handedness and the gene for alcoholism? Or is it because the world is actually slightly more difficult for left-handed people, which you lefties will know this. You know, the scissors aren't designed for us, and all kinds of stuff isn't designed for us. I tell you, it's hard to be left-handed. But it's not very hard. It's only a little harder than to be right-handed. And so I think the given heritability literature, I think, is weak, and geneticists confirm that it's weak. I don't think we really know much about the inheritability of addiction at all.
Any more questions?
That's plenty.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.